Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization Part 1. Today's lecture, we're going to move out of these early civilizations and we're going to see that civilization is going to begin to spread. So we look at the early Iron Age, and then we'll see the rise of two mighty empires. So grab a pen and paper, a keyboard or tablet, and get prepared for the early Iron Age.
The Iron Age. The spread of civilization, 2000 to 1000 BC. Focus. The Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age saw the spread of civilization to new regions and new peoples emerge. How were these newcomers able to make contributions that would ultimately make the Middle East a richer and more interconnected place? Okay, so what am I asking you in this question? Well, we're going to see that there is some pretty big changes that occur in the Middle East. And not all of them necessarily great at the time, but because of these changes, we're going to see that the Middle East actually ends up richer and more interconnected. People are better able to communicate and travel and so on and so forth. So, let's see. The first thing I want to talk about is the spread of civilization outside of the river valleys to what we might call rain-watered land. That is, land that doesn't require irrigation, but is actually watered by rain. Well, early on, these regions were difficult to sustain a surplus big enough to allow for civilization. That's why we see in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, these are the real foundations of civilization. Irrigated agriculture produces a big surplus. It's relatively easy to grow crops in these areas. And so these are the first two areas that we see civilization beginning to emerge. And one of the problems is that we don't have enough surplus to support an elite. And really it's the elite that, along with craftsmen, who create civilization, if you think about it. All right, we saw that in Mesopotamia. It's once they get the surplus, and then you could have the craftsmen, then you could have the priests and science and all that good stuff. Well, contact with the river valleys would ultimately enable some of these areas, and the areas that are rain-watered are kind of these areas in maybe light green here. So, these areas here and over in here and in here and up into here. All right. These are areas that get enough rain to be able to support civilization, but don't use irrigation. All right. Now, one of the ways that civilization ultimately gets spread to these places is through conquest, either from one of the river valleys or from maybe even outside barbarian groups. All right. And so these groups will come in, they'll see these peasant farmers who are now growing enough because of technologies like the plow, and they'll impose themselves on them and charge them rents and so on and so forth, and then compel them to work and to do their bidding on their behalf and set themselves up as their rulers. And so we see civilization, sometimes you get an elite that way. As fond as we are of civilization, we must always remember the quote by Will Durant that civilization is a parasite on the man with the hoe. In other words, for the simple farmer, civilization is always sponging off of him, and he gets little back in return. Another way that areas are brought into civilization is through trade. The River Valley civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt, have had big appetites for raw materials. And so their merchants would go out, maybe contact some of these newly established elites and offer them luxuries from civilization, from Mesopotamia, from Babylon, in return for some natural resources. And these elites would then impose their own people to go out and chop trees down or to mine or do something on behalf of the River Valley civilizations. And so gradually, the point is civilization begins to emerge throughout what we call the Fertile Crescent here. Okay. Now we're going to look at three new regions. 3 regions that kind of come into civilization, I don't know, kind of really beginning 2000 BC or thereabouts. And these 3 areas are the Levant, which is on the eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and the Aegean. And that's going to be the origin of later Greek civilization, which we'll devote a whole special unit to. Okay. Well, first the Levant. The Levant is, as I mentioned, this area here, kind of along the east coast of the Mediterranean. Modern-day countries here would include Israel, Lebanon, the West Bank, places like that. And these places, this Levant, became civilized early on because it was the major route between Mesopotamia, which is out here, and Egypt, which is down here. In order to get from here to here, you'd have to follow the Euphrates and the Orontes and go down here. And so kind of this middling position enabled a variety of cities to emerge in this area. And the area also produced some important commodities like wine from their grapes and also olive oil from olives which grow in the region. So they also contributed. In addition to this area, another area was Asia Minor, which is up in here. Okay, and Asia Minor has the Taurus Mountains in it. And the Taurus Mountains are very rich in natural resources, particularly minerals and metals. So it was loaded with iron and copper and silver and lead. And this attracted the Mesopotamians. Mesopotamians were poor in these things, and so Mesopotamia is down here. And Mesopotamian merchants early on, again around 2000 BC, began to migrate as traders into the area. And so this area was heavily influenced by Mesopotamian civilization. Lastly, we have the Aegean, and particularly at this point, the island of Crete. Some of you may have heard of the Minoan civilization. And Crete, being located in the middle of the Mediterranean, was in a position to take part in sea trade, basically middlemen between the Egyptians and the people of Asia Minor and Greece and places like that. And so any native elite began to emerge there, and cities began to form. Okay, well, aside from these places that kind of became civilized, the Middle East always had kind of marginal people. We might call them barbarians, although that term is not always favored, but we'll go with it. So, the barbarians. Well, the barbarians at this point live partly on the fringes. So just to the south of Mesopotamia and to the west of Egypt were these desert nomad people. And a lot of they were herders and so on, tend to, live a nomadic lifestyle. And sometimes they would trade and take part in civilized society, but oftentimes they would also raid and pillage when the opportunity presented itself. Another place that was a source of barbarian peoples was the mountains. Okay, so these mountainous people up here, they were on the margins of civilization. Again, sometimes they trade, they had minerals and whatnot. But, when the opportunity presented itself, they would also raid and take by force. So these were kind of Near Eastern barbarians, if you want to think of them that way. But there was also, there was a much bigger barbarian pool out there. Up in the Central Asian steppe, up in here, we get southern Russia, Kazakhstan, and places like that. We had even bigger barbarian groups. And this area was inhabited by a group of people called the Indo-Europeans. And they're going to be a very important group in Western civilization. At this point, they're steppe barbarians. They live on this grassland up there. But eventually, these people are going to be the ancestors of many of the European languages, especially like English. English is an Indo-European language, as is Spanish and Italian and Greek and Russian, and these are all Indo-European languages, a language family. Just like when we talked about the Semitic languages in a previous lecture with Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic, and these are language families. Well, these early Indo-Europeans were partly agriculturalists and partly pastoralists, nomads. They tended to live in tribal sort of arrangements. And beginning around 2000, they began to attack, particularly at first from the east, this way, because they were close to the Middle East here. And they began to infiltrate. And one of the things about the barbarians is usually they could be held at bay because, well, the civilized societies had more people, more densely populated. They were better organized, usually had the technological edge. But barbarian peoples could cause problems occasionally. For one, they had a simpler, more egalitarian society. So there was greater equality among the barbarians. This shouldn't surprise us because what we see with civilization is it often leads to stratification and all sorts of inequalities and hierarchies and so on. Well, furthermore, among the barbarians, every man was essentially a warrior. So even though they might not have had a lot of people compared to civilized societies, well, when every person is bearing arms, well, they could be formidable. Also, barbarians tended to be flexible. One of the things about civilization is it tends to develop its structures and maybe gets stuck in a rut. Barbarians could be very inventive. And so it's likely that the horse was domesticated around 3000 BC on the steppe. That's where they're native to, and the grassland, they can feed off of it. Soon the bit was developed. That's the part that goes in the horse's mouth and allows you to direct the horse in the way that you want it to go. And the barbarians even improved upon the wheel, which had been invented in Mesopotamia, but which the barbarians improved upon. They added spokes to it, and they made the light chariot, which was very fast and very effective, especially among barbarians who were also good at bowmanship. And so they would, appear very quickly with their bows, and they would be able to hunt down their enemies, and they were incredibly effective early on. And so at times, temporarily, barbarians could even overwhelm major civilizations, which they did on numerous occasions. But invariably, either the barbarians would settle down and adopt civilization and soften up a bit, or the natives would adopt the new technology and drive out the barbarians. Oftentimes, barbarians then were opportunistic. They would wait for the right time and strike during times of revolt. One of the most consequential of the barbarian invasions was the invasion of the Sea Peoples, which occurred around 1200 BC. And this invasion was particularly troubling because it came not from the usual direction that barbarians were expected to come from the east. It didn't come from that way. It actually came from the west. And unlike traditional barbarian invasions, which were on chariots, these were by sea. And ships were the primary vehicle. And so around 1200, armed invaders came from the west, from the area that's now Greece and beyond, and they began to sweep into the Middle East. And it's not a lot is known about this. There's a lot of mystery surrounding it. Who exactly were these people? What were they up to? But it does seem like it was more than just a hit-and-run invasion. It was more like a migration. And so you can see the Middle East here. The Middle East had a couple of nice little civilizations, and they all pretty much were getting along, and everything was nice and clean and orderly. And then, whack, you have these Sea Peoples come. Many of them came from the West, like I said, Indo-European groups. They were able to drive off some of the kingdoms of Asia Minor. They were able to sweep down along the Levant, even defeating the Egyptians. Babylon was thrown into a turmoil. Groups of desert nomads, Semitic speakers like the Arameans began to invade in, the Hebrews began to invade in, and a variety of groups that we're going to look at. And in their wake, we saw the nice, orderly, neat empires. In their wake, you get a bunch of tiny little small groups of people. A few of them I'll just mention. The Philistines, if you ever read the Bible, you'll know the Philistines. They're kind of like the arch enemy of the Jews. Israel and Judea, which is right over here. These were Semitic speakers. You also have groups of Arameans, which settle in here. They're an important group that we'll look at. Along here, you have the Phoenicians. All right, they settle there. Out over here, it's not on the map, you have the Lydians. We'll talk about them. And a variety of different groups. Now, all of this turmoil really had a tough effect on the Bronze Age and Bronze Age civilization. Part of the Bronze Age was, based off of the palace. Well, if palaces are getting sacked and temples are getting sacked, things are pretty rough. And so we know that the temples were where all the writing would occur and the record keeping. And as these get sacked and burned, well, we lose a lot of our records. Temples and palaces also controlled trade, and so trade would have been disrupted. And they also supported the workmen. And so this is a time where things get pretty bad, right? There's not a lot of writing going on. The workmen aren't being supported. And so the products that are churned out, there's not a lot of building. It's just a tough time. Tough time for civilization. But there's a term that they use in business called creative destruction. It's kind of like when there's a big shake-up in the market. A lot of times, even though it sucks to be around at that time, some new inventions begin to emerge. And that's one of the things we see here. Now, the ancient economy early on had been based off of bronze. As a matter of fact, we call that era the Bronze Age because it was the major metal that was used. Now, bronze is what's called an alloy. It's a combination of tin and copper. And these two elements are very rarely found together. They need to be brought together to create this copper. Now, bronze. Now, copper is pretty plentiful, but tin is relatively rare and hard to come by, especially in the Middle East. And for you economists out there, you know that when something is rare, it makes it more expensive. And the more expensive it is, the less people can have it, right? Well, the tin trade was severely disrupted during this time. And so people had to get creative. And one of the ways they got creative was by experimenting with iron. Now, iron seems to have been perfected in the region of Asia Minor. And there were a couple of technological barriers to using it. One was getting it hot enough. It needs to be really, really hot. And this was overcome by using charcoal and carbon mixtures and so on and so forth. They were able to get better ovens, and people were able to finally overcome the technological barriers necessary to turn this iron into steel. And aside from being a much better tool, much better material, it's a lot harder and sharper and so on and so forth. Iron is also extremely plentiful. And what this meant is that the average person for the first time could begin to own metal tools and weapons, things like the plow, the sickle, the scythe. All of these things were going to make people so much more productive because, well, they finally had access to metal. And more productivity meant people were going to be richer. In addition to that, it made weapons cheaper, and the mass of infantry a reality, so that you could actually afford to arm everybody. And we're going to see that that's going to have implications as well. Now, another area that this Iron Age had an effect on was writing. As I mentioned, the temple priesthoods had really been in charge of writing. And they had used cuneiform. Now, one of the disadvantages of cuneiform is that it has thousands of different symbols, and so to learn it is really hard. I mean, as we know, we suffer from illiteracy in our civilization, and we only have 26 letters. So you can imagine if you could learn thousands of letters, well, most people don't have the time to do that, and so only a small percentage of the population could actually read. And it also required these temples and a very elaborate system to keep it going. Well, during the disruption, a new alphabet began to emerge, and it began to emerge in an area called Phoenicia, which we'll look at. And this alphabet was greatly simplified. It was only 22 letters. And it's the ancestor to our alphabet. As a matter of fact, if you look from right to left at the top, the first letter is Alf, which is their A, and the second letter is Beth, which is their B. And so the alphabet, that's where we get the word alphabet from just the AB, I guess. And because it uses sounds, well, you can write any language in it. We know we can write English in the alphabet, or you could write Spanish, or if you wanted to, you could even write Chinese. The point is it uses sounds, and that's its big advantage. It only requires 22 letters. It was also aided through the spread of a new writing medium, papyrus, which had been invented in Egypt, but was the ancestor to our paper. Well, aside from new technologies, new animals were domesticated, like the camel. The camel first came into wide use around 11,000 BC and originally came from Arabia. Camels are fast, strong, and as we all know, they do well without water for a long period of time. The use of camels allowed a great shortening of trade routes. You didn't have to follow the rivers closely anymore. And camels allowed desert travel, and so they opened up whole new regions. The era also saw the first use of money. And money is great because it eases transactions. If people are going to be trading more, money was going to be a necessary invention. Prior to that, it was barter. But of course, to barter, you need to find two people who want to exchange this opposite products, and they have to agree on a product. And if you find someone that has something you need, but they don't want what you have, it's very clumsy and awkward. But if you have a agreed upon medium, money, well, I might not even want anything at this particular time, but I can sell my product for money and store up wealth so that when I do want to buy something, then I can use it. And so the earliest coins were invented in an area called Lydia, which I mentioned, and they greatly facilitated trade. As a matter of fact, it's from this region that the stories of King Midas emerge. You may remember Midas from the legend of the king who had the golden touch. Well, the kernel of this probably originated in the great wealth that was generated from this area. Whether King Midas actually touched things and turned them into gold, well, I don't know about that, but it's probably a nugget of truth in there somewhere. One of the things that we begin to see improve because of some of these technologies is the early Iron Age economy. And this is partly thanks to improved agricultural techniques. Remember, agriculture is what most people do. 90% of people at this time are agriculturalists. So a new invention in agriculture is a pretty big deal, and it affects really just about everybody. And so things like the steel-tipped plow allowed farmers to go into new territories that had heavy soil, and to begin to turn them over and get at the rich nutrients. One of the reasons people had preferred river valleys early on is, well, with the primitive technology, just a stick pulled by an ox, well, you can kind of scratch soft soils, but if you want to get at the really dense soils, well, they were just off limits. Furthermore, the iron axe allowed people to clear out woodlands and open up whole new areas. Things like the sickle and the scythe also allowed for the quick harvesting of crops. And anytime there's a big agricultural development, it creates more wealth. At least for the landlords, or the people who are, collecting the surplus. And these individuals who collect the surplus often demand more luxury items. And a group of people by the name of the Phoenicians were well placed to supply individuals with these luxury items. Phoenicia is located over here. Essentially modern-day Lebanon. And this area is very mountainous. But from ancient times, one of the commodities that were produced here was wood. So the cedars of Lebanon were famous, in demand all throughout the Middle East, because there's not a lot of trees. One of the things that the Phoenicians put their wood and their trees to was to build ships. The Phoenicians became great traders by using these ships. And they were famed throughout the ancient world for their dyes. Famous crimson dyes, which they made from crushing this sea snail type thing called a murex, created this vivid crimson that was so expensive and so coveted throughout the Middle East. Now, the Phoenicians soon saturated the markets of the Middle East and began to search out for new markets with their galley ships. See them here. They use oars and sails. It has a prow in the front that can be used for ramming, so they're defensive and offensive and trade, war, you name it. They're a very versatile ship. But these Phoenician merchants began to go out into the Mediterranean in search of raw materials, new markets. And as they sailed along the coast of the Mediterranean, and this was very brave of them because this was an area that wasn't really well known at the time. And as they went along, they would often found colonies, maybe trade areas to deal with trade with the locals, or places where their ships could pull in at night. And some of these colonies became very important in their own right. And one of them I want you to memorize is Carthage right here. This is going to be really important later. So tuck that away in your memory banks. The Phoenicians sailed all the way to Spain. They sailed even into the Atlantic. probably as far away as Britain and Morocco and Africa. And they were really harbingers of civilization. They brought civilization along with them wherever they went, and they became fabulously wealthy as a result. Now, while the Phoenicians were exploring the Mediterranean, their neighbors just to the east, over here, a group of people called the Arameans, another new group, they were making use of the camel, and they were pioneering many of the caravan routes. And so their caravans were able to ply the deserts of the Middle East. They were able to greatly shorten the trade route from Mesopotamia over to Egypt. Previously, you had to go along the Euphrates. They were able to penetrate deep into Arabia, down to Sheba, modern-day Yemen, I think, or is it Oman? I forget. I get them confused, but modern-day country down there. And Arabia, of course, was rich in aromatics, nice-smelling stuff like frankincense and myrrh and gold, and that may sound familiar to you. And so these Aramean merchants would bring these commodities up through the Middle East. They'd stop along at these oasis towns guarded by Arabs. Some of these towns became cities of their own, like Mecca and Medina, that would be so famous later on in Islamic civilization. And the Syrian capital, Damascus, up here became a major intersection, kind of a crossroads between north-south trade and east-west trade. Also became fabulously wealthy. And because Aramean merchants could be found everywhere, their language, Aramaic, became the international language of the Middle East. Many educated people could speak it. Merchants could speak it because, well, almost anywhere you went, you'd find Arameans. And along with the script of their neighbors, the Phoenicians, their phonetic script, their alphabetic script, communication throughout the Middle East was greatly facilitated. And money transactions, people were more often going to the market because, they could use money now and there are goods to buy, and they had more money in their pockets because of agricultural productivity. And so as people travel, as people communicate more, as people trade more, the differences in the Middle East between peoples, like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, began to wear down. Regional differences began to erode, and more, the Middle East was becoming a unified whole. And even some barbarian peoples were inspired by traders like the Arameans or the Phoenicians, and so more and more people were being brought into the light of civilization. Okay. What I'd like you to do is answer this question. The Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age saw the spread of civilization to new regions and new peoples emerge. How were these newcomers able to make contributions that would ultimately make the Near East a richer and more interconnected place? Answer that focus question and then turn to our second lecture.